So, welcome everyone. Bienvenue à cette conférence de pratique en analyse de données. This is a workshop offered by the Statistics Laboratory of the Centre de Recherche de Mathématiques, and it is financially sponsored both by the CRM and by CANSI. So we would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors. I'm very excited today. We have a really fascinating lineup of speakers from a variety of different backgrounds who will be talking to us about best practices for thoughtful and ethical handling of demographic data, and a lot of common questions that can arise in handling sensitive demographic data. So rather than take time, I'd like to just dive right in. So we will begin with our first speakers, Dr. Rubab Arim and Evelyne Bougie from Statistics Canada. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my colleague Rubab and myself are honored to have been invited to present today's workshop. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work in Ottawa, which is the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. So this workshop's focused on best practices in thoughtful and ethical handling of population data. Lends itself pretty well to a presentation about Statistics Canada's disaggregated data action plan.
I'm sorry, please go ahead, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
I think someone unmuted themselves accidentally.
Perfect. Okay, so in this workshop, we'll talk about Statistics Canada's Disaggregated Data Action Plan, the DDAP. So in this context, we will provide you with an overview of this plan, along with a particular focus on a recommended systematic approach to research involving disaggregated data. So we'll talk about best practices and guidelines under this approach, and we'll talk about top challenges. And finally, we'll quickly go through a list of our recent publications and ongoing projects and training related to disaggregated data analysis. But first, you may ask yourself, or not, but you may ask yourself, why disaggregate data? Well, in social, health, and even economic research, an estimate for the total population of Canada is far from telling the whole story, right? So aggregates hide important differences in the lived experiences of particular population groups. And so by breaking down statistics into more refined categories, we're able to uncover important differences across different groups. As can be seen now in this example using representative population data from the CCHS, so the Canadian Community Health Survey, an important survey at Statistics Canada. So we can see here that COVID-19 vaccine willingness varies between different population groups and across different age groups. In other words, by disaggregating the data away from the national estimate, we start to see more vaccine hesitancy in certain groups. And so understanding these differences in vaccine willingness between population and amongst population groups can help inform public health messaging related to vaccines. So this underscores the policy relevance of disaggregating data at finer levels. We can better inform communication efforts aimed in this case, in this example, at increasing vaccine willingness amongst groups identified as having lower intentions. And so it is in this spirit that StatsCan developed its Disaggregated Data Action Plan, DDAP, which Rubab will talk about more in the next slide.
Thanks, Evelyne. So the purpose of the Disaggregated Data Action Plan, DDAP, is to achieve a more equitable Canada by collecting, analyzing, and disseminating disaggregated data to improve insights and decision-making. And really, at the society level, accessing to disaggregated data is very important. There are 4 guiding principles of DDAP. Number 1 is data and analysis should be disaggregated at the lowest level of population detail possible while respecting quality and confidentiality. And we're going to certainly come back to this principle in the next slides. Secondly, analysis should focus on intersectionality. It's not about young, it's not about Blacks, it's not about women only, but it's young Black women, as opposed to those binary interactions. Thirdly, Statistics Canada's approved standards should be used for disaggregation across all programs to allow interoperability. And we're going to come back to that when we're going to be talking about standards, the importance of using standards in research. Finally, data should be available at the lowest level of geography possible. One of the things we often hear is that Atlantic Canada is only existing at the federal level. So not only just provinces and territories, but other lowest level of geography possible, such as neighborhoods, other communities. The first, what we call essential disaggregation within the DDAP, are the 4 employment equity groups: Indigenous people, racialized people, gender, and disability status. So these 4 groups are really the main focus. But then there are other additional disaggregation priorities as well, such as sexual orientation, official language, children, senior, immigrants, low income families or individuals, as well as veterans. The Disaggregated Data Action Plan really is across the whole entire agency, and there are different authorities at different levels. One of the working groups for this action plan is Analytical Insights Working Group, which is set up as a discussion forum, which really serves as an advisory role and works closely with other working groups of the DDAP to advance the action plan. Here you can see the mandates that are very much related to analytics and insights. And this working group recently made a top recommendation, and they suggested that disaggregated data analysis must follow a systematic approach to research. And in the next slides, I'm going to be kind of going into a little bit further details in terms of what is that systematic approach to research. Now, most of us in this virtual room are researchers, so I'm not going to go into the details of every single circle and boxes that you are seeing, because you're very much familiar with the systematic approach to research. But I do want to use this, this slide as an opportunity to use it like a refresher kind of opportunity. So I'd like to highlight 3 things here. Number 1 is the loop that you're seeing from the interpretation, communication of results to the issue identification. And that means when you finished a product, when you have your outcomes, those outcomes are always reinforcing new ideas, new issues, new questions. The second thing I'd like to highlight here is the ongoing engagement and communications at the bottom of the slide. And thirdly, not every research or not every analytical product can lend itself into disaggregation. And that is very important, and we will come back to that. It all starts with a guided specific research question, but then you may need to consider what has been done previously, and does disaggregation make sense or not? Let me give you an example. So let's say that you would like to measure discrimination and socioeconomic disadvantages among population groups. As I said, all starts with a research question. What is the specific research question you have in mind? What has been done in that area previously? What are your key variables? How are you going to measure discrimination? And in what context you would like to measure these concepts, or you would like to conduct your study? Who are your primary stakeholders, perhaps partners along this process? What is the appropriate methodology, data, approach that you can use? Which standards you should be considering? And finally, how are you going to interpret and communicate your results? And what will be your product?
All right. So this next slide sort of reiterates what Rubab just explained. So the systematic approach to research, in fact, emphasizes that disaggregated data analysis is not a fishing expedition, nor is it about doing many cross-tabulations until one finds something significant. So rather, disaggregated data analysis needs to be guided and purposeful. Throughout all the steps of the analytical process or our systematic approach to research. And also, you know, not all research projects can nor should be disaggregated, and the level of disaggregation will depend on the nature of the analytical project, the data that is used to investigate the topic, the methodology used to analyze the data confidentiality requirements, and so on. So next, we will sort of take a deep dive into each of these steps, and we're going to focus on best practices and guidelines for thoughtful and ethical analysis of population data throughout this systematic approach to research.
Thanks, Evelyne. And on this slide, I put it a little bit early so that people can kind of guide themselves to best practices and guidelines. The first best practice and guideline we would like to share is our necessity and proportionality framework. Now, we are in the digital era and information needs, let's just say that, are growing every single second. And with our partners, with our experts from businesses, from academia, from around the world, really, we are developing statistical methods based on two principles: necessity and proportionality. And really, this is the first best practice and guideline that we would like to share. The necessity principle is about for whom this information is necessary. Let's just say that you would like to produce some information so that hospitals or schools can be built. What is the essential information is needed and for whom is needed? Once the necessity principle is met, the next step is proportionality. So for the proportionality principle, when we plan surveys, usually we do develop data collection strategies, and these strategies take into account a lot of different ethical considerations, which we're going to be sharing soon again. And it's the proportionality principle that allows us to collect the data that we need and not more than that, while we respect privacy, fairness, as well as transparency issues. Now, at Statistics Canada, these two principles have been followed for many, many years, but it's really recently that these two principles are put together into a new scientific framework. And I will be sharing a link where you can read more about this new framework. And so these principles are really expanded on a new scientific approach that is allowing us to guide us in research and in our data collection activities. Now, we talked about ethics, we talked about privacy. Now, let me give you some examples of possible ethical issues related with the use of data. So number one is sometimes your data might be biased and you might actually inform decision makers with wrong data, with basically wrong information. Another way that we are not often careful about is using data that can reinforce existing inequalities. The example I gave a moment ago about discrimination, we need to be careful that we do not analyze or examine discrimination to reinforce existing discrimination or inequalities within the society. And we can actually go back to history to see other examples, such as how research on intelligence, for example, was really used to reinforce some type of discrimination within the society. Thirdly, privacy intrusion that is not proportional to the benefit of a project. Are you getting enough data, necessary data that you need, or are you getting or trying to get more data that will unfortunately cause a privacy intrusion issue? In some cases, sometimes there is also inappropriate language when presenting results. This is often happening when there are no standards yet, or standards in development, and individuals are simply not guided well. So researchers should also be careful about this. And finally, p-hacking. I'm guessing we all heard about this one. It's really trying and trying until your p level is less than 0.05, and off you go, you can publish your article. So these are just some of the examples that are bringing up possible ethical issues related to the use of data.
All right. So next we talk about, sources of one's choices of data source, right? in analyzing data, because one's choice of data source is crucial in determining the level of disaggregation that is feasible. So there are pros and cons of each type of data source. Here we are going to talk about surveys, administrative data, and linked data. The advantages of using surveys, so big population survey, they're representative often of the population that they serve. They have, they contain multiple measures, often thematic in nature. Our surveys at Statistics Canada and Health are often thematic in nature, with a deeper dive on mental health for one round and a deeper dive on other things on another round. However, there are often limitations in terms of sample to support very fine disaggregation for multiple population groups, right? Because we're going away from just cross types with two variables, and we really want to dig deep into the lived experiences of young women from a particular background, or older men from, you know, a particular background. So unless there was an oversample that was done for a particular group, it's a limitation. You may have limited sample to support very fine levels of disaggregation. Turning to administrative data, hospital data, vital stats, mortality, death, and birth statistics. For sure, it's a census of all events. So you are going to have a larger sample size to start with, right? You have all records. However, these administrative data sources often lack those socio-demographic information to identify particular population groups, right? So you're more limited in the analysis that you want to do to identify people from different groups, or the lived experience of different people. And so this is where linked data has become a really more and more used, at least at Statistics Canada, because identifiers are added to databases. So identifiers from a survey or from the census is added to an administrative database. So we're leveraging the information that is present in both. But even linked data have their own limitations. They're numerous. There are a lot to enumerate, but potential bias due to non-links is an example of that. So, you know, the big idea here is your choice. There's always a trade-off between sample size and availability of detailed information into the data sources that you're going to find. Whatever you choose to do at the end of the day, make sure that your sample size allows you to respect data quality. So, you know, you don't want small sample size that's going to give you low quality estimates with wide confidence intervals. And if you use a coefficient of variation as a data quality indicator, make sure that that they're appropriate. But also you want to make sure your sample size allows you to respect gives you enough statistical power to run the desired analysis, because an underpowered analysis is not appropriate, and it is even harmful, right? You don't want to reject a null hypothesis or conclude that there's no differences between the group or this phenomenon is not observed in a certain group just because you don't have enough statistical power to do it, right? So so sometimes it's an underpowered analysis is harmful, right? You're rejecting the null hypothesis just because you don't have the sample size. So the next two slides we'll talk about, now we're getting into talking about issues of confidentiality, which I alluded to a bit, which was alluded to a bit before. So here a good way to talk about confidentiality and how you can make sure that you have the tools to assess confidentiality is the 5 safes framework. It's useful because it makes affecting use of the data, which is confidential or sensitive, and it's often the case when disaggregated data at fine levels, right? You run into confidentiality issues. So the 5 safes framework breaks down the decisions surrounding data access and data use into 5 dimensions. So first, think about safe projects, right? Is the use of the data appropriate, lawful, ethical, and sensible? Then you have safe people. Can the user be trusted to use the data in an appropriate manner? Are the data accessed and analyzed by accredited users? Then you have safe data. Does the data itself contain sufficient information to allow confidentiality to be breached, right? Have the data been de-identified and anonymized before being shared with the users? Then you have safe outputs. Does the access facility limit unauthorized use of the data, or are outputs assessed for confidentiality by applying vetting rules? And finally, safe settings, right? Are the data hosted in a secure environment? So data users should make, or data custodians and data users should make sure that the data is safe enough before planning on analyzing and releasing information. Next slide. So again, on the confidentiality issue, given the differences, you know, many different surveys and data sources have different guidelines. So the analysts have to make due diligence and have to acknowledge that they have themselves responsibilities for thoughtful and ethical analysis of data. So always read the user guide of the data set that you're using. The user guides provide confidentiality and data quality recommendations that should be applied and typically answer a lot of the questions that people can raise. Always consider the risks of the data that you're publishing. So coming back to the different sources of data that one can choose, administrative data or census data are considered riskier than survey data because they include everyone, and so the risk of identification are higher. Unweighted descriptive statistics are considered riskier than the weighted statistics, so always publish or use weighted statistics when weights are available. So cell size, be wary of zero cells, small cells, but also full cells, right? You want to look at your table and you know, even if it's not a small sample size, a particular statistics that you're publishing, but it's a full cell. For instance, if you're disclosing that 100% of people in this particular occupation, in this particular neighborhood, make an income of more than $150,000 a year, then everybody knows that all the people in this neighborhood with this occupation make this salary. So even though it's a full cell, you didn't have a small sample size, you're disclosing the information for everybody in that cell. So that's a risk of confidentiality breach. And so there's also rounding that can be applied to your statistics. So always read the user's guide and the and all you know, technical documents that may be made available for you. And if you're still not sure on how to make sure that you are not breaching confidentiality in your analysis, for sure, if using Statistics Canada's data sources, you can consult with subject matter services or confidentiality experts at StatsCan. We're always very happy to chat with users and contribute to good analysis.
So let's pause on that small cell size problem because we probably have encountered very similar challenges in our research, if not once, many times. What do we do when we have a small sample size, small cell size? Do we exclude them? Do we merge them? Do we combine with other things? Do we try to publish them? And most of the time you will not be able to disseminate those results because of confidentiality principles that we have at Statistics Canada. On this slide, we would like to provide two perhaps examples or two methodological choices you might be able to consider. The first one is sex at birth and gender, and you can see that we are providing a link to the article where you can learn more about not just sex at birth and gender, but also other variables such as ethnicity and what type of methodological choices we at Statistics Canada are considering to balance confidentiality with the release of disaggregated data. So the first one is how we dealt with the gender variable. In Census 2021, for the first time, we had sex at birth variable that had 2 categories, and we had a gender variable that had 3 categories, including transgender, cisgender, and non-binary persons for both men and women. So when we wanted to release these statistics, the non-binary persons, the small sample size or the small cell size was creating issues for us to be able to release any information for this group. So what the experts decided to do at Statistics Canada is basically to randomly distribute non-binary persons between men and women categories to create men plus, women plus categories. Now, this choice was not just made out of the blue. There were a lot of justifications, a lot of thoughts, and a lot of discussions, consultations with the experts. And basically the decision or the justification was that if we will not be able to release any of these information because we risk disclosure, but we still want to exclude them to contribute to the information that we would like to release, then we need to find a solution. So because just releasing information on non-binary persons would create a risk of disclosure, randomly distributing them to the other two groups allowed us to release their information, and that's why this this decision was made. Another methodological choice that individuals, researchers can consider is a small area estimation to improve the estimates. So let's say that you are interested in smokers in Ottawa. And you can estimate that from the estimates you have for Ontario or perhaps even for Canada, for example. Three things I'd like to highlight here is that more research at Statistics Canada in recent years has been completed in this area, and there have been many applications in the last year, especially for our well-known surveys such as Labour Force Survey and Canadian Community Health Survey. And also some recent applications in terms of use of machine learning, ML methods to facilitate modeling. So those are our current focus. I'm saying our, but it's really our methodology colleagues. Neither Evelyne nor myself are methodologists, but we are closely working with them, especially when we would like to release some results for some of the smaller groups that we do have in our data. So every study has key variables. I'd like to go back to the example that I provided. So when we would like to measure discrimination and socioeconomic disadvantages among population groups, what do we mean by population groups? And that's where standards, the importance of standards, the use of standards come to play. Standards, as you can see on this slide, increase the value of data, harmonize data, allow for interoperability, which is really about effectiveness. It reduces costs and it improves transparency and trust. And it also allows for greater data sharing. At Statistics Canada, we have various tools, including classifications, variables, statistical units, variance. So if we go back to population groups, it is a variable that is measured with three classifications first. Single population group, multiple population group, and I can't remember the third one, but I think it's one of those multiple and plus. And in the first single population group, we do see 13 categories. So for those of you who are familiar with this variable, we have white, for example, Black, Chinese, Korean, West Asians, and even other multiple groupings and other type of population groups that people write in their answers. So when a researchers would like to use or focus on population groups, standards are always there for you to take a look and use them in your research rather than creating your own labeling or your own grouping. And of course, whether, for example, you would combine Japanese people with Korean people, it really depends on your research question and the context you are doing your research. So again, it always goes back to the first issue statement that you are having in your study. Over to you, Evelyne.
Yep. So here we're kind of like, if you remember the systematic approach to research, you issue identification, you did your analysis, it chose a data source, employed the right methodology. But at the end of the day, you want to tell a story, right? You want to interpret your data. And so we're at the end of this systematic approach to research when you're finally ready to share your findings. We have learned here at StatScan from stakeholders and the data users that one specific story about a specific group is often better than an amalgamation of findings from different groups into the same story, right? So it would not be a good idea to write one paper about a certain health outcomes, for example, of Black Canadians and the Indigenous First Nations Métis Inuit populations, right? Each group deserves its own separate narrative because context is key to include when you are interpreting data at very fine levels. Right, and just as a side note, it's ill-advised as well to produce estimates for the Indigenous population. Always disaggregate at a minimum for the three groups, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Canada, right? Because each group has their own culture and histories and different ways in which these play out in their health outcomes, for instance, of today, right? So, also at this stage, seeking feedback. When I say that context is key to interpreting data at granular level, very finely disaggregated data, when you get into the stories and the lived experiences of particular group, there are sensitivities surrounding these topics or those findings. And you don't want to perpetuate stereotypes or reinforce current inequalities. And so go back and consult with the relevant partners and stakeholders for their interpretations of your results and to see if you are reporting the data in a sensitive way and in a way that will improve the lived experiences of these groups. So really, there's like a lot of thought that have to be put into that last stage of the process where you're ready to share your findings. Next.
I'm cognizant of our time, so I'm gonna skip some of the slides very quickly, but what Evelyne mentioned is really the importance of engagement and communications throughout the whole process of systematic research. And on this chart, what I'm showing is the engagement continuum, where as you move from just informing the public to creating a partnership with the public, you are actually increasing the influence, and both the influence and the involvement in decision making. So that's where you actually do see most influence, most involvement from everybody. Now, let's say that you followed all the best practices and guidelines. There will still be a lot of challenges in your disaggregated data analysis. What we just talked up to now, it will come back every time you will come up with a specific research question. But you do have those guidelines there. You do have those best practices there. It all starts with a well-informed research question. And perhaps a phased approach to your research would be much more, much better, or much more feasible, let's say. Meeting the needs of the end users for populations. So you do need your appropriate research design. You do need a meaningful interpretation and communication of your results. And that just goes back to engagement and communications throughout. On this slide, I'm showing you the 6 guiding principles that we at Statistics Canada are using for every new project, for every new data collection. And perhaps these can also guide you in your research projects. So what is the benefit to Canadians? What are some privacy and security issues that you need to consider? First, do not harm principle. Are you fair? Trust and sustainability. Are you transparent, and are you holding yourself accountable? And finally, do you have good data quality? Do you have good data to produce your results?
So we are going to go through the last few slides rather quickly. These are just to highlight our recent publications that we have ongoing, and we are going to share the deck. The links are there to recent papers that apply the disaggregated data analysis action plan. And I also want to highlight, we have a data literacy training initiative. It's free. You have access to, under the learning catalog, to lots of videos. We have 2 videos on ethics and data analysis, for instance, but lots more. So, and we are also working on an analytical training for DDAP. We had a pilot in November for internal Statistics Canada people, but we will be expanding it externally. And so some of the key messages from this training, or from, you know, what we want to pass on to analysts, is that, you know, be purposeful and justify your choices of disaggregation with identified information needs and gaps from the literature. Engaging the relevant partners and the stakeholders from the start, not just at the end, from the start. Be mindful of your own due diligence to get familiar with the confidentiality rules of the data sources that you're using and apply the rules. If you're using StatsCan data, use approved StatsCan standards, and, you know, using appropriate methodologies when confronted with small sample sizes. Some of these methodologies can be quite complex, so search for information, search for training. We are developing this kind of training internally for our own analysts. It's a work in progress. So, je pense que ça conclut notre présentation. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. La présentation est disponible en français. Si vous êtes intéressé à avoir les diapositives en français, envoyez-nous un courriel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I would like to open the floor to any questions. You can put it in the chat, or indeed, please just unmute yourselves and feel free to jump in. We have about 5 minutes before we will introduce our next speaker. Maybe while people gather their nerve or type their questions, I just would like to make a comment, which is one that I found really interesting, your point about non-binary individuals and the importance of not simply removing people from analyses. I think there is a huge, just a great importance in ensuring that people who contribute their data are used and are seen, even if they must be randomly allocated. You know, I mean, the privacy protections do still require some changes. I just think it's really important not to simply omit or erase people.
Yeah.
Thank you, Erica, for that comment. That's exactly the thought Statistics Canada had, rather than excluding. Now, one of the other things we usually talk about is, so going back to the population groups example, if we cannot publish results for, you know, West Asians and Blacks, for example, do we combine them? And, you know, we're still having ongoing discussions. Is it meaningful to combine them? And that depends on the purpose of the study. That depends on the research question. In some cases, we do combine perhaps Japanese and Koreans, but in other cases, we think that it's perfectly fine to say that, sorry, but we do not have good quality data to publish these results, but we still keep them separate. And
do you ever consider publishing data that are poorly powered, you know, wide confidence intervals, but nevertheless providing that information?
Excellent question. If we do publish, well, actually, if it's really, really wide, the answer is we do not. But in some cases, again, depending on the research question, depending on the information needs, sometimes we do disseminate, but with lots of neon lights around it.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Statistics Canada tables. You're going to have an E, use with caution, beside the estimate. That means that the estimate is publishable because we need not suppress it, but it's associated with a wide confidence interval, probably a small sample size. So use with caution. Do not base your narrative or your whole story on that particular estimate because it's not quite strong.
And I see there's a question in the count. A question in the chat I was reading as I was speaking. Do you think there is a non-binary undercount in 2021? And if so, how do we correctly assign survey weights?
That's an excellent question. Is it possible? It might be possible. To be honest, I do not know. And whether can we correct the survey weights, that goes to methodology. Now, Sometimes small area estimation could be completely biased because you still need to make some assumptions when you use those methodology choices. And if you are really off from your assumptions, then your production will be wrong as well. I don't have a perfect answer for this one. It is possible.
It's the first time we gather the information, right? So we'll see. Yeah, maybe people will be, maybe we had some non-binary persons that weren't ready to self-identify as non-binary on an official census because it's the first time that we ask this question, right? And so we may see variations in the future, a large increase, not because there's more people who are suddenly non-binary, but people become more at ease and trusting that, yes, I can self-identify as non-binary on the census, right? So are we underestimating it right now? Probably. But we don't know because it's the first time that we measure this category. So it's a work in progress.
Wonderful. We're happy. We would love to, if you would like to share for feedback the paper, Jack, we would love to connect you with the right people. Because as I mentioned, neither Evelyne nor myself is methodologists, and we certainly have way better experts. So just don't hesitate to reach us, and then we'll connect you with the right people.
Well, thank you so much. And we will, with your permission, be posting your slide deck in French and English on the CRM website. We really appreciate this. Merci beaucoup.
Merci.